The sound of a name, sharp and cutting, sliced through the hum of the classroom. Jamal Carter! Mrs. Thompson's voice was the kind that left no room for hesitation. Instantly, 20 sets of eyes turned toward the back of the room, where Jamal sat by the window. His head jerked up, the distant world beyond the glass shattered by the sudden call. His heart quickened as his classmates' whispers filled the silence. Amusement for some, dread for others. But for Jamal, it was the cold rush of fear. Mrs. Thompson, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, stood at the front of the room with a whiteboard marker in hand. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she gestured to the board, where a complex equation sprawled in blue ink. The problem was an intricate maze of variables and fractions, far beyond what the eighth-grade curriculum demanded. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, a setup. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jamal rose from his seat. His chair scraped against the floor, a sound too loud in the uneasy quiet. The soft glow of the autumn sun through the windows seemed too warm, too out of place against the cold anticipation that filled the room. Jamal's feet felt heavy, each step to the front a mile, his palms damp as he neared the board. His classmates sat forward in their chairs, a blend of curiosity and expectation on their faces. There were smirks from a few, the kind that said they expected him to fail, to crumble under the pressure. Jamal had always been quiet, a background character in the story of their middle school lives. No one really noticed him, and now suddenly all eyes were on him. Mrs. Thompson stepped back, giving him the marker. Her expression was unreadable, but the edge in her gaze was unmistakable. She wasn't just teaching a lesson, she was making a point. The kind of point teachers made when they wanted to show the rest of the class what happens when you don't pay attention. It was a power move, and Jamal felt it deeply. He took the marker, its plastic cool and firm against his skin. The room seemed to blur around the edges. The only clear thing was the board in front of him. The equation stood there, unapologetic, a mountain daring him to climb it. His mind buzzed, 100 thoughts racing, but beneath the fear, a small, steady voice reminded him, "You know this. You can do this." Jamal took a breath, slow and deliberate. He began to write. His first strokes were hesitant, the tip of the marker whispering against the whiteboard. He started by simplifying a fraction, breaking it down into smaller components. His movements were cautious, but his hand grew steadier with each line. The initial murmurs behind him quieted, the room sinking into a deeper silence. As he moved from one step to the next, the equation began to unravel. His mind, so often wandering, found focus. Jamal isolated variables, combined like terms, and methodically dismantled the problem piece by piece. His hand moved faster, a rhythm forming between his thoughts and the board. The challenge that was meant to corner him became an opportunity to reveal something more, a hidden skill, a quiet talent. The class shifted in their seats. Some of the smirks disappeared, replaced by wide-eyed attention. Even Mrs. Thompson's posture softened, her arms uncrossing as she watched him work. The atmosphere transformed from expectation of failure to a suspenseful hope. Was he really doing this? Was he solving it? Jamal's expression remained calm, his eyes never leaving the board. There was no need to glance back at the room. He felt the weight of every gaze, but he refused to let it bend him. His confidence grew with each step closer to the answer. He moved past the midpoint of the equation, simplifying, correcting, refining. His mind was a few beats ahead, already seeing the conclusion before his marker reached it. And then, just like that, he circled the final answer. The solution sat there, clear and correct. Jamal stepped back, the marker capped with a quiet click. He turned to face the room, his breathing steady, though his heart still drummed in his chest. There was a beat of absolute silence, a pause where the entire class seemed to recalibrate what they had just witnessed. For the first time, Jamal didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He had been called out, tested, and he had stood his ground. There was no applause, no grand reaction, just the soft rustle of realization settling over the room. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted, the sharpness in her eyes dulling to something more thoughtful, more careful. She had expected a lesson to be learned, and perhaps it had been, but not the one she intended. The lesson wasn't about paying attention or discipline. It was about potential, the kind of potential that hides in the quiet corners of a room, waiting for a chance to be seen. Jamal had been given that chance, and he had taken it. Not with loud words or bravado, but with the quiet strength of his mind. As he walked back to his seat, he noticed the way his classmates looked at him. Not with ridicule or annoyance, but with something closer to respect. A shift had occurred, one he hadn't expected, but one he would not let slip away. Jamal sat down, his notebook still open to a blank page. He picked up his pencil, the room slowly returning to its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Jamal sat at his desk, the weight of the room's silence pressing against his back. His notebook lay open, pages as blank as his expression. The air around him seemed different, thicker, almost charged. He could feel the shift, the way his classmates' gazes lingered a little longer, the murmurs softer but more pointed. It was as if the moment at the board had crystallized into something tangible, something he couldn't shake off. He wanted to disappear, to melt back into the wallpaper of the classroom, but the weight of his own achievement anchored him in place. Mrs. Thompson's expression had softened, a small but significant change. Her sharpness, usually reserved for those she thought were slacking, had given way to a quiet curiosity. She shuffled the papers on her desk, her mind visibly turning over the unexpected outcome. Jamal had not only met her challenge, but had dismantled it piece by piece, showing a depth of understanding far beyond what she had expected. For her, it was a revelation, a reminder that talent often lay hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The bell rang, shattering the fragile stillness. Chairs scraped against the floor, backpacks were slung over shoulders, and students poured out of the room like water through a broken dam. Jamal moved with them, his body on autopilot, but his mind still replaying the last few minutes. He felt a pat on his shoulder, a fleeting gesture of acknowledgement, but he didn't turn to see who it was. The hallway swallowed him up, the noise of lockers clattering and sneakers squeaking against linoleum a welcome distraction. As he walked, his thoughts raced. He had never intended to stand out. His quiet demeanor was his shield, a way to navigate middle school without drawing attention. But now that shield had cracked. He wondered if it was a good thing, if being seen could lead to something more than just awkward glances and whispered questions. His mind danced between possibilities and doubts, a constant push and pull that left him feeling unsteady. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Math class became the quiet undercurrent of conversations in every other room he entered. His name floated through the air, not in the usual forgettable way, but with a new edge. Some students approached him, hesitant but genuine, asking if he could help them with their assignments. Others just watched, still unsure of how to reconcile the quiet kid by the window with the math prodigy who had emerged. Jamal responded as he always did, with a shy nod, a soft sure, but inside he felt the ground beneath him shifting. When the final bell rang, he made his way home, his feet moving on autopilot. His house, a modest single story with chipped white paint and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze, felt like a sanctuary. The quiet was different here, more forgiving. He dropped his backpack by the door and sank onto the living room couch, the fabric worn but comforting. His mother, her gentle eyes always a mix of love and quiet concern, appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask him anything, just sat down beside him and handed him a glass of water. It was her way, silent support, always there when he needed it. Jamal sipped the water, the coolness grounding him. He wanted to tell her everything, to let the words spill out and release the pressure building inside him, but he hesitated. His mind worked through the equations of his own emotions, trying to solve for what this all meant. His mother didn't push. She simply rested her hand on his knee, a solid, warm reminder that he wasn't alone. Eventually, he managed to explain the day's events, his voice even and measured, as if recounting someone else's story. She listened, her expression shifting from surprise to pride, her fingers tightening around his knee in quiet encouragement. The evening slipped away. Jamal found himself at the kitchen table, his notebook open, but this time not for schoolwork. He sketched out problems, not because he had to, but because it soothed him. Numbers had always been his refuge, a place where things made sense, where chaos could be reduced to logic and order. The pencil moved almost on its own, lines and curves forming solutions to problems he invented for himself. Outside, the sun set, painting the sky with soft oranges and pinks, but he barely noticed. Sleep came slowly that night. Jamal lay in bed, the ceiling a blank canvas for his thoughts. His mind traced over the equation from earlier, the steps, the way his hand had moved with growing confidence. He felt a strange mix of fear and excitement, a tug of war between wanting to stay hidden and the pull of something greater. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be on the edge of something new, the precipice of change. His breathing slowed, his eyes grew heavy, and as he drifted off, the last thought he held on to was not of the fear, but of the possibility. The next morning, as he walked into school, the atmosphere felt different. He noticed the way the hallways seemed a little brighter, the way the air held a note of anticipation. His classmates greeted him with nods, some even managing small smiles. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift in how they saw him. Jamal moved through the day with a quiet resolve, each step a promise to himself. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew he had to follow it. Beneath the surface, the undercurrent of something new began to stir. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Jamal stood in line with a dozen other students, their expressions a mix of nervousness and determination. The gymnasium had been transformed into a makeshift testing center, with folding tables, worn plastic chairs, and proctors moving through the rows with clipboards. Posters promoting the city's math competition hung on the walls, their bold fonts and bright colors a stark contrast to the pale, fluorescent lighting. Jamal felt the weight of the room, the collective pressure settling over him like a heavy blanket. A tall man in a navy blazer and wire-rimmed glasses stepped to the front of the room. His voice cut through the hum of anticipation, clear and steady. He introduced himself as Mr. Holden, a coordinator from the district. He spoke of the opportunities the competition could provide: scholarships, advanced classes, the chance to meet other students who shared a love for math. His words seemed to float just above Jamal's head, not quite reaching him. All Jamal could focus on was the crisp stack of test papers in Mr. Holden's hands. When Mrs. Thompson had first mentioned the competition, Jamal hadn't thought much of it. He had nodded politely, thinking it was one of those things teachers said to encourage students. But now, standing in this room surrounded by faces he barely knew, it felt real. Too real. His pulse thrummed in his ears, a steady reminder of the stakes. He knew this was more than a test. It was a chance. And chances didn't come around often. Mr. Holden began handing out the papers, moving methodically through the rows. As he approached, Jamal forced his breathing into a steady rhythm. His fingers curled around his pencil, the wood digging into his skin. When the test landed on his desk, the sound was louder than it should have been. He stared at the first page, the questions lined up neatly in columns, each one a small mountain waiting to be climbed. The proctor signaled the start, and the room fell into a soft chorus of pencils scratching against paper. Jamal's hand moved almost instinctively. Numbers, formulas, and variables unfolded before him. He worked with precision, his focus sharpening with every problem he solved. Each answer built on the last, a series of small victories that propelled him forward. The noise around him faded, the room shrinking until it was just him and the page. But halfway through, a question stopped him cold. It was a logic problem, wrapped in layers of complexity. Jamal's mind stalled, the gears slipping out of sync. His pencil hovered over the page, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He could feel the minutes slipping away, each tick of the clock a reminder of how little time he had left. Doubt began to creep in, thin and insidious. His breathing quickened, his chest tightening under the weight of expectation. He closed his eyes, pulling his thoughts back from the edge. His mother's voice echoed softly in his mind, the quiet reassurance she had offered the night before. She believed in him. Mrs. Thompson believed in him. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe in himself too. Jamal opened his eyes, the page coming back into focus. He broke the problem down into smaller parts, finding his way through the confusion. His pencil moved again, slower this time, but deliberate. When he wrote the final answer, a small sense of relief washed over him. The rest of the test flowed more easily. His confidence returned in small bursts. each solved problem a step closer to the finish line. When the proctor called time, Jamal set his pencil down gently, his hand trembling. He looked around, noting the expressions of the other students, some hopeful, others defeated. He couldn't read his own feelings, a jumble of nerves and cautious optimism. As the tests were collected, Mr. Holden spoke again, his tone encouraging. He promised quick results and a follow-up with those who advanced to the next round. Jamal listened, but his mind drifted. He had done all he could. The rest was out of his hands. He stood with the others, filing out of the room into the hallway. The change in atmosphere was immediate, the sharp tension dissolving into the normal chaos of middle school life. Lockers clanged open, students called to each other, and the world moved on as if nothing monumental had just occurred. Jamal slipped away, finding a quiet corner by the windows. He needed a moment to breathe, to let his mind settle. He watched the trees sway outside, their branches bending but never breaking. There was a lesson in that, he thought, something about resilience and finding strength even when the wind blew hardest. He sat there until the bell rang, the sound pulling him back to reality. He gathered his things, his movements careful, deliberate. As he walked to his next class, he held his head a little higher, not with arrogance, but with a quiet resolve. Whatever happened next, he knew he had given it his all. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Jamal sat at his usual spot by the window, his notebook open but untouched. The faint hum of classroom chatter washed over him, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been 3 days since the test, and every moment since had stretched with anticipation. Each time the classroom door opened, his heart jumped. He wanted the results, needed them, but the waiting gnawed at him, turning his nerves into raw edges. He tried to distract himself with schoolwork, but numbers and words blurred on the page, slipping away before he could grasp them. Mrs. Thompson moved through the room, handing back assignments. Her face was a practiced mask of neutrality, but Jamal noticed the way her eyes flicked to him, a subtle shift that made his pulse quicken. She reached his desk, a paper in her hand. It wasn't his homework, it was a letter, the envelope crisp and white, with the district's seal in the corner. His breath hitched, the room tilting slightly as he took it. His fingers felt clumsy, the envelope heavier than it should have been. The world narrowed to that small rectangle of paper. His classmates seemed to blur, their voices a muffled hum. Mrs. Thompson's expression remained steady, a slight nod giving him the push he needed. He slid his finger under the flap, tearing it open with a sound that seemed to echo. The letter inside was folded neatly, the print sharp and professional. His eyes moved over the words, the sentences forming slowly in his mind. Congratulations. Advance to the next round. The competition was a week away. A rush of emotion flooded him, a mix of relief, joy, and something sharper, fear. The opportunity was real, tangible. He had proven himself, but now the real challenge lay ahead. His fingers tightened around the paper, the edges pressing into his skin. He forced himself to breathe, to let the reality settle in. His classmates continued on, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his notebook as if it might disappear if he let it out of his sight. When the bell rang, Jamal moved through the hallways on autopilot. His feet found their way to the library, the quiet stacks a refuge from the noise. He slid into a chair by the back window, the same spot he often retreated to when he needed space to think. He pulled the letter out again, rereading it to make sure he hadn't imagined it. His name was there, printed clearly. His achievement, undeniable. But with it came the weight of expectation, a new kind of pressure. His mother's face flashed in his mind, the way her eyes had softened when he told her about the test. She had always believed in him, quietly, consistently. His father's nod of approval, a rare but treasured gesture, came next. They had given him so much, worked so hard to provide him with opportunities they never had. This wasn't just his chance. It was theirs too. A way to honor their sacrifices, to show them that every late night, every extra shift had been worth it. Jamal took out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. He began to write, not equations this time, but thoughts, goals, a list of what he needed to prepare, to study. He broke it down into manageable parts, each step leading him closer to the competition. His handwriting was neat, the lines straight, the letters small but confident. He had always been good at organizing his thoughts, at finding patterns in chaos. This was just another problem to solve, another equation to break down. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, surrounded by books and the soft rustle of pages. His world narrowed to the rhythm of study, the gentle pull of focus. The nerves remained, a low hum under the surface, but he turned them into fuel, a steady current that pushed him forward. He worked through practice problems, read through old competition questions, and mapped out strategies. His pencil moved steadily, the eraser worn down to a nub as he refined his answers, always searching for the simplest, most elegant solution. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Jamal had filled several pages with notes. His hand ached, his eyes were tired, but a sense of accomplishment settled over him. He packed up his things, slipping the letter back into its envelope, and headed home. The walk felt different this time, his steps lighter, the path more defined. He had a direction now, a purpose. It steadied him, giving him something to hold on to as the world moved around him. At home, his mother greeted him with a gentle smile, her hands dusted with flour from the kitchen. The smell of baking filled the air, warm and comforting. Jamal held out the letter, his expression careful, his heartbeat loud in his ears. She took it, her eyes widening as she read. Pride bloomed on her face, a soft, radiant joy that made his chest tighten. She didn't say much. She never needed to. But the hug she gave him spoke volumes. It was tight and reassuring, a reminder that no matter what happened, he had a place to return to. That night, Jamal lay in bed, the room dark and quiet. He stared at the ceiling, his mind tracing over his plans, his goals. The competition was a week away, but for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He had a path forward, a plan. His dreams drifted in numbers and formulas, a tapestry of possibilities woven with careful thought and quiet ambition. He knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, but he also knew he was ready to face them. With every breath, he moved closer to the next chapter, his future unfolding one step at a time. The morning of the competition dawned crisp and clear. Jamal stood at the edge of the auditorium, the wide doors looming over him as students filed inside. His fingers gripped the strap of his backpack, the fabric warm and worn under his touch. He could hear the murmur of voices, a blend of excitement and nerves, as the competitors settled into their seats. Each step forward felt heavier, as if the weight of the day pressed down on him with every inch closer to the threshold. He had spent the last week preparing, his evenings filled with practice tests and problem solving, but now standing here, a new wave of uncertainty washed over him. He moved with the crowd, finding an empty seat near the back of the room. The auditorium was grander than he expected, its high ceilings and polished floors adding a layer of formality that made his pulse quicken. A large screen at the front displayed the competition's logo, a simple design, clean lines with a mathematical symbol at its center. The image seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart, a reminder of the challenge ahead. The host stepped onto the stage, his voice steady and welcoming. He outlined the competition rules, the format of the test, and the prizes awaiting the winners. Jamal listened, his mind a careful balance between absorbing the details and keeping his nerves in check. The host announced that this year's competition would include a new section, logic puzzles and real-world math scenarios. Jamal's stomach twisted. He had prepared for equations, for advanced algebra and calculus. But this new element felt like uncharted territory. Test booklets were handed out, and Jamal's hands felt clammy as he accepted his. The paper was cool against his skin, the printed questions a blur until he forced his eyes to focus. He took a deep breath, his fingers smoothing the edge of the page. The proctor's voice signaled the start, and the room fell into a heavy silence, punctuated only by the soft scratch of pencils. The first few questions were familiar territory. Jamal moved through them quickly, his pencil dancing across the page with a practiced ease. His confidence built slowly, each answer a small stone added to the foundation beneath him. But as he turned to the second section, the ground shifted. The questions were unlike anything he had seen before. Word problems layered with ambiguity, logic puzzles that twisted through paragraphs. His momentum faltered, the pencil in his hand hesitating just above the paper. He felt the weight of the room around him, the quiet concentration of his peers, and for a moment the walls seemed to close in. His mind raced, each thought slipping through his grasp before he could make sense of it. He blinked, his vision sharpening, and forced himself to focus. He broke down the first problem into smaller parts, dissecting the language until the numbers beneath became clear. His pencil moved again, slower now but steady. Each answer came with a little more ease, the fog lifting as he regained his rhythm. Minutes bled into each other, time a slippery thing he couldn't quite hold on to. He reached the final page, his mind a tight coil of concentration. He worked through the last problem, his hand cramping, but his focus unbroken. When the proctor called time, Jamal set his pencil down gently, the small click of wood on wood, a strange punctuation to the silence. He exhaled, a slow release of breath that carried the tension out of his body. Around him, chairs creaked as students leaned back, their own relief mingling with his. The tests were collected, and the competitors were given a break while the scores were tallied. Jamal stood, his legs unsteady, and made his way to the hallway. The cool air outside the auditorium bit against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth within. He found a spot near a window, the glass fogged with the condensation of dozens of breaths. He wiped a small circle clear, his eyes tracing the skyline beyond. The city felt far away, a different world, but in this quiet moment, he felt anchored. A group of students gathered near him, their voices a soft hum. One of them, a boy with tousled hair and a confident smile, moved closer. Jamal recognized him from earlier. Robert, a competitor from a nearby school. Robert leaned against the wall, his expression open and friendly. He started talking about the test, sharing his own doubts and the challenges he faced. His honesty was disarming, a reminder that even those who seemed unshakable had their own fears. Jamal listened, his own worries easing as he realized he wasn't alone. The announcement to return to the auditorium pulled them back. Jamal walked with the group, his steps more certain, the connection with Robert a quiet reassurance. The room felt different now, the pressure still present but not as suffocating. The host took the stage again, his presence grounding as he began to announce the top scores. Names were called, applause following each one. Jamal's pulse thrummed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He counted each breath, a rhythm that kept him centered. When his name rang out, the sound carved through the noise around him. He stood, the movement automatic, his feet carrying him to the stage before his mind fully processed what had happened. The applause was a wave, building and cresting, and for the first time he allowed himself to ride it. He accepted the certificate, the cool paper tangible proof of his accomplishment. His eyes scanned the crowd, catching a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson in the back, her expression a blend of pride and something softer, more personal. Jamal stood there, the lights warm against his skin, and felt a new kind of certainty settle in his bones. This was more than a win. It was a turning point, a door opening to a future he hadn't fully allowed himself to imagine. As he left the stage, the certificate clutched in his hand, he knew this was just the beginning. The path ahead was still uncertain, but with each step it became a little clearer, and this time he was ready to walk it. Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, the certificate resting on his lap. His room was a small sanctuary, its walls lined with books and worn posters of mathematical formulas and famous scientists. The sun cast long shadows through the window, and the soft hum of a ceiling fan provided a steady rhythm to his thoughts. The events of the competition played in his mind on a loop, each detail sharp and vivid. He could still hear the applause, feel the cool paper of the certificate under his fingertips, and see the look of pride on Mrs. Thompson's face. It was a memory he wanted to hold on to press into the pages of his life as something permanent and undeniable. His mother knocked gently before entering, her soft smile a mirror of his own. She sat beside him, her presence warm and steady. She didn't say much. She rarely needed to. But the way her hand rested on his shoulder spoke volumes. He could feel the weight of her pride, the quiet strength of her support. She had always been his first teacher, the one who showed him how numbers danced in patterns and how curiosity could lead him anywhere he wanted to go. Her belief in him was a constant, an unwavering light even when his own confidence dimmed. Jamal leaned back against the wall, his head resting against the cool surface. The reality of his achievement began to settle, the initial rush of excitement giving way to a more measured reflection. The competition had been a test, not just of his mathematical skills, but of his ability to stand under pressure, to face his own doubts. He had always been good at hiding, at keeping his head down and avoiding the spotlight, but now that part of him seemed smaller, quieter. The boy who once found comfort in the background was starting to see the world from a new perspective. As the afternoon slipped into evening, Jamal found himself at his desk, his notebook open and pencil in hand. He wasn't doing homework. There was none assigned that day. But his mind craved the familiar structure of equations and the comfort of logic. He began writing out problems, not for a grade but for himself. He sketched diagrams, plotted graphs, and let his mind wander through the possibilities. The numbers flowed, each line a small victory, each answer a reminder of what he could do when he allowed himself to try. A soft chime from his phone drew his attention. It was a message from Robert, the boy he had met at the competition. Robert's words were brief but genuine, a simple congratulations and an invitation to join him and a few others at a study group next week. Jamal felt a spark of something new, a bridge between his quiet world and the broader one he had glimpsed at the competition. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, before typing a response. Yes, he would join them. The decision felt significant, a step forward into a space he had always thought was meant for someone else. School on Monday held a different kind of energy. His classmates greeted him with nods and smiles, a few offering high fives as he walked through the hallways. Even those who had never spoken to him before seemed to see him in a new light. He wasn't just the quiet kid by the window anymore. He was Jamal, the math whiz, the one who had stood on stage and shown what he was capable of. It was strange, this shift in how others saw him, but it wasn't unwelcome. He felt a thread of connection, a sense of belonging that had always seemed just out of reach. Mrs. Thompson approached him after class, her expression a careful mix of professionalism and warmth. She mentioned a summer program, one designed for students who excelled in STEM subjects. She offered to help with the application, to write a recommendation letter. Jamal listened, his mind mapping out the opportunity, the path it could lead him down. It was daunting, but it was also exciting. He nodded, accepting her help, and felt a new sense of purpose settle into his bones. In the days that followed, Jamal began to find a rhythm. He balanced schoolwork with his newfound commitments, attending the study group with Robert and exploring the world of advanced mathematics. The group welcomed him openly, their conversations filled with theories and ideas that sparked his curiosity. They debated solutions, challenged each other, and pushed the boundaries of what they thought they could achieve. Jamal thrived in this environment, his mind stretching in ways he hadn't known it could. He started to see the world differently, noticing patterns in everyday life, finding connections where others saw only chaos. At home, his parents noticed the change. His father, usually reserved, started asking him about his studies, listening intently as Jamal explained his latest project. His mother continued to support him in her quiet way, her encouragement a steady thread that wove through every conversation. Jamal felt their pride, their hopes intertwined with his own. He carried it with him, a reminder that his journey was not just his own, but a part of something larger, a legacy of hard work and quiet resilience. One evening, as he sat by the window, a soft breeze stirred the papers on his desk. Jamal watched the world outside, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. He thought about the boy he had been, the one who hid behind his own silence, and the boy he was becoming, the one who stepped onto stages, who shared his thoughts and let his voice be heard. The journey was not over. It was just beginning. But he felt ready. He had found his place, not just in the world of numbers, but in the world itself. And as he sat there, pencil in hand, Jamal knew he had already solved the most important equation of all, discovering who he was meant to be. Jamal sat in the back of the crowded room, the low hum of whispered conversations filling the space around him. The summer program had started just a few days ago, but already he felt the push and pull of its intensity. The other students moved with a confidence he hadn't yet found, their voices rising and falling in discussions about physics theories and coding challenges. Jamal listened, absorbing their words like a sponge, but his own voice remained quiet, edged with uncertainty. He had stepped into a new world, and while the path forward was clear, the first steps were always the hardest. The instructor, a tall man with silver hair and an easy smile, moved to the front of the room. He held a stack of papers, each a gateway to the next challenge. Jamal's fingers tightened around his pencil, the familiar weight of it grounding him. The task for the day was a team project, a complex problem that required not just individual skill, but collaboration. The instructor began dividing the students into groups, pairing names together with practiced ease. When Jamal's name was called, he found himself matched with two others, Sophia, a girl with sharp eyes and quick wit, and David, whose calm demeanor balanced her energy. Their table was a small island amidst a sea of focused faces. Jamal set his notebook down, his movements careful, deliberate. Sophia wasted no time, her voice quick as she laid out a plan. David nodded along, his pen moving steadily across his own notebook. Jamal watched, his mind racing to keep up. He felt the familiar prick of self-doubt, the sense that he was a step behind. But then, as Sophia hit a roadblock in her calculations, Jamal saw the solution. His hand moved almost before he could think, the pencil gliding over the paper as he filled in the gap. Sophia paused, her eyes scanning his work. A moment of silence stretched between them, and then she smiled, a brief but genuine expression. It was a small thing, but it broke the ice, shifting the dynamic of their group. Jamal found his footing, his confidence blooming in the shared space of their collaboration. The project unfolded, the three of them moving in rhythm, each building on the other's ideas. Jamal's mind clicked into place, his thoughts sharp and clear. The numbers and variables became more than just symbols. They were tools, pathways to a solution they shaped together. By the end of the session, their project stood out. The instructor's feedback was positive, his praise directed not just at their result, but at the way they had worked together. Jamal felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet satisfaction that settled deep in his chest. This was new, the sense of belonging, of contributing to something greater than himself. He packed up his things, his movements lighter, the weight of the morning's uncertainty replaced by a gentle optimism. Outside, the sun hung low, painting the sky in soft hues. Jamal walked with Sophia and David to the edge of the campus, their conversation easy and unforced. They talked about the project, about the next steps in the program, but also about the little things, favorite books, music, the best places to grab lunch nearby. Jamal found himself laughing, a sound that felt both foreign and familiar. He realized that he hadn't just made teammates, he had made friends. The days blurred together in a rhythm of classes, projects, and late-night study sessions. Jamal found his stride, his voice growing stronger in discussions, his ideas woven into the fabric of their work. He and his group continued to collaborate, their skills meshing in a way that felt natural. Sophia's quick thinking, David's steady hand, and Jamal's quiet precision became a blend that others noticed. Their group was asked to present their project to the program's board, a chance to showcase not just their solution, but their journey to it. On the day of the presentation, Jamal stood in front of the small crowd, his heart beating a steady rhythm against his ribs. He held his notes, but his hands were steady, his mind clear. Sophia opened, her voice strong, drawing the audience in. David followed, his explanations clear and concise. When it was Jamal's turn, he took a breath, the room narrowing to just him and the story he needed to tell. He spoke of their process, the way they had learned from each other, how each challenge had become a stepping stone. His words flowed, not just facts, but a narrative of growth and discovery. The applause was warm, genuine. The board members asked questions, their curiosity a sign that the presentation had struck a chord. Jamal answered some of them, his responses measured and thoughtful. He felt the shift again, the subtle change in how he was seen, not just as a smart kid, but as a contributor, a leader. He caught Mrs. Thompson's eye in the audience, her expression a quiet echo of the pride he felt. When the event ended, Jamal lingered in the hall, his certificate of achievement tucked under his arm. Sophia and David joined him, their faces bright, still riding the high of their success. They made plans to meet up, to continue working together even after the program ended. Jamal agreed, the words slipping out with an ease that surprised him. His world had expanded, the edges of it no longer defined by quiet corners and solitary moments. He had stepped into the light, and the view from here was filled with promise. As he walked home, the city around him seemed more vivid, each step a reminder of how far he had come. He knew there would still be challenges, moments where doubt might creep back in, but he also knew he had the tools to face them, the knowledge, the support, the quiet strength he had built piece by piece. His story was still being written, each day a new line, each achievement a chapter. And for the first time, Jamal felt not just hope, but certainty that the story ahead would be one worth telling. Jamal woke up to the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through his window. The air was cool, carrying the promise of a fresh start. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and let the quiet of his room settle around him. His desk was still cluttered with papers and notebooks from the night before, equations and ideas scribbled in the margins. He had fallen asleep late, his mind too busy with thoughts of the presentation and the opportunities that lay ahead. It was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from effort and progress. He moved through his morning routine with a sense of purpose. His mother was already in the kitchen, her movements calm and practiced as she prepared breakfast. She handed him a plate, her smile warm and knowing. She didn't need to ask how he felt. Her eyes said she understood. They shared a quiet meal, the clinking of silverware the only sound. When he stood to leave, she reached out, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment longer than usual. It was her way of saying everything would be all right. The bus ride to school was different now. Jamal no longer kept his headphones on, a barrier between him and the world. He sat with Robert, their conversation flowing easily as they discussed the latest math puzzle they had been working on. Robert's laughter filled the space between them, his enthusiasm contagious. Jamal felt lighter, the weight of his own expectations no longer pressing down on him. He had found a rhythm, a balance between who he was and who he was becoming. At school, the hallways were busy with the usual rush of students. Jamal moved through the crowd, his steps sure, his shoulders back. He felt the shift in how people saw him, the way nods and smiles greeted him as he passed. His classmates had started to include him, their questions about homework evolving into genuine conversations. He found himself surrounded by a group of peers who shared his interests, who challenged him and celebrated his successes. It was a new kind of belonging, one he had not known he needed. Mrs. Thompson met him outside her classroom, her expression a blend of pride and excitement. She had received an email from the summer program organizers. They had been so impressed by his work during the competition and the presentation that they wanted him to apply for a scholarship to an advanced math camp. The camp was designed for students with exceptional talent, offering access to college-level courses and mentorship from leading mathematicians. It was an opportunity that could change everything, opening doors he had never thought to knock on. Jamal's mind raced as he took in her words. The scholarship meant more than just a summer of learning. It was a bridge to his future, a chance to explore his potential in ways he hadn't imagined. He felt the familiar stir of nerves, but this time they didn't pull him back. Instead, they pushed him forward, fueling his resolve. He thanked Mrs. Thompson, his voice steady, his gratitude clear. She handed him the application, a thin packet filled with questions and forms. He slipped it into his backpack, the weight of it a reminder of what lay ahead. The rest of the day moved quickly. Jamal attended his classes, his focus sharp, his energy high. He worked through problems with a new sense of purpose, his pencil moving with confidence across the pages. His teachers noticed, their feedback positive, their encouragement genuine. He met with Robert and Sophia during lunch, their conversation turning to the scholarship and what it could mean. They offered to help with his application, to review his essays and practice for the interview. Jamal accepted, his appreciation clear in the way his shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away. That evening, Jamal sat at his desk, the application open in front of him. He read through each question carefully, his answers forming in his mind. The essay prompt asked about his journey, about the challenges he had faced and the lessons he had learned. He thought back to the quiet boy he had been, the one who sat by the window, lost in thought. He wrote about the competition, about the way standing in front of his classmates had felt like stepping into a new world. He wrote about the friendships he had made, the support he had found, and the strength he had discovered within himself. The words came easily, each sentence a reflection of his truth. He didn't try to sound impressive or use big words. He just told a story. He wrote late into the night, his hand moving steadily across the page until the essay was complete. When he finally set his pen down, he felt a sense of closure, as if he had captured a part of himself in those pages. He read through it once more, checking for mistakes, but also feeling the weight of his own growth. It wasn't just an essay. It was a testament to how far he had come. Before bed, Jamal showed the essay to his mother. She read it slowly, her eyes moving back and forth across the lines. When she finished, she looked at him, her expression soft, her pride unmistakable. She didn't say much, just hugged him tightly. The warmth of her embrace a promise that no matter what happened, he had already achieved something incredible. Jamal held on to that feeling, letting it settle into the deepest parts of him. As he lay in bed, the room dark and still, Jamal allowed himself to dream. He thought of the camp, of the possibilities that awaited him. He pictured himself walking through new halls, meeting new faces, learning new things. He imagined the challenges, the late nights of studying, the thrill of solving problems he had never encountered before. His mind danced with equations and ideas, the path ahead a canvas waiting to be filled. Sleep came softly, his dreams woven with numbers and light. He had taken another step, each choice a thread in the tapestry of his future. And as the night held him, the world beyond his window breathing in gentle rhythm, Jamal knew that the story he was writing was only just beginning. Jamal sat on the worn leather couch in the waiting area of the math camp's admissions office. The room was quiet, the soft hum of a nearby printer, the only sound cutting through the silence. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tracing the fabric of his jeans, as if the motion could smooth away the nerves that had settled deep in his chest. The scholarship interview was just minutes away, and he felt the weight of every decision, every choice that had led him to this moment. His application, carefully crafted with Mrs. Thompson's guidance, had passed the first round. Now it was up to him to show them who he really was. The door opened, and a woman with a kind smile called his name. Jamal rose, his movements deliberate, steady. His legs felt light, almost disconnected from the ground. But he focused on each step, grounding himself in the present. The interview room was bright, a round table at its center surrounded by 3 chairs. 2 of the chairs were occupied by the interviewers, Mr. Holden, whom he recognized from the competition, and Dr. Patel, a professor known for her work in applied mathematics. Jamal sat down, his back straight, his hands folding neatly in his lap. Mr. Holden began with easy questions, asking about Jamal's interests and what had inspired his love for math. Jamal spoke softly but clearly, his words shaped by genuine passion. He told them about his early fascination with numbers, how math felt like a language only he understood. He shared stories of quiet afternoons spent solving puzzles, of the thrill he felt when a complex problem unraveled under his pencil. His voice gained strength as he moved through his answers, the initial hesitation giving way to a natural flow. Dr. Patel leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. She asked about challenges he had faced, moments when things hadn't gone as planned. Jamal paused, considering her words. He talked about the competition, the fear that had threatened to hold him back, and how pushing through it had been a turning point. He mentioned his journey from the quiet boy in the back of the class to someone who found value in his own voice. His honesty filled the room, his story not just about math, but about growth, resilience, and finding his place in the world. The interview shifted into a problem-solving exercise. Dr. Patel presented a scenario, a real-world problem that required both logic and creativity. Jamal's mind moved quickly, his thoughts mapping out possibilities. He approached the problem methodically, breaking it down into smaller, manageable parts. His pencil danced over the paper, numbers and symbols coming together in a sequence that felt natural, intuitive. When he finished, he explained his process, his voice steady. The interviewers nodded, their expressions showing both interest and approval. Time seemed to fold in on itself, the minutes slipping away faster than he expected. When the interview ended, Mr. Holden thanked him, his tone warm, encouraging. Jamal stood, the chair creaking softly as he pushed it back. He shook their hands, the gesture firm but not forced, and left the room with a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had given them his truth, shared not just his knowledge but his journey. Whatever happened next, he knew he had done all he could. Outside, the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the campus grounds. Jamal walked slowly, his feet finding their own path along the cobblestone paths that wound between buildings. He let his mind drift, replaying the interview, searching for any missed opportunities or missteps. But as the breeze brushed against his skin, a soft, cool reminder of the present, he let those thoughts go. Worrying wouldn't change the outcome. All he could do now was wait. The next few days tested his patience. He returned to his routines, balancing schoolwork with the study group and quiet evenings spent at his desk. His friends, Sophia and Robert, offered support, their confidence in him a buoy that kept his spirits afloat. Mrs. Thompson checked in, her encouragement a steady presence in his life. His mother continued to provide her quiet strength, her belief in him as constant as the sunrise. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, the letter arrived. Jamal found it in the mailbox, its crisp envelope standing out against the usual pile of bills and advertisements. His name was printed neatly on the front, the camp's logo in the corner. His hands shook slightly as he carried it inside, his feet moving with a deliberate slowness. He sat at the kitchen table, the house still and quiet, and opened it with the care of someone handling something fragile. The first line of the letter brought the world into sharp focus. He had been accepted. The scholarship was his. Jamal read the words over and over, his eyes tracing the ink until the letters became a part of him. The letter outlined the details: travel arrangements, what to bring, the schedule for the first week. His chest filled with a warmth that spread to his fingertips, his skin tingling with the reality of what this meant. This wasn't just a chance to learn. It was a doorway to the future he had only dreamed of. When his mother returned home, he showed her the letter. She didn't speak at first, her eyes bright, her hand covering her mouth. She pulled him into a hug, her embrace a tight, steady thing. Jamal felt the weight of her pride, the way it wrapped around him like a blanket. She had always believed in him, even when he had not believed in himself. Now her faith had found solid ground, a testament to the hard work and quiet perseverance that had brought them to this moment. Jamal spent the evening sharing the news with his friends, their voices crackling through the phone with excitement. He messaged Mrs. Thompson, her reply almost immediate, filled with exclamation points and kind words. Each conversation solidified the truth of his achievement, each shared moment a reminder that his journey was never a solitary one. His story was woven with the support and guidance of those who had walked beside him, their footprints etched alongside his on the path to this new chapter. As the sun set, casting long shadows across his bedroom wall, Jamal sat at his desk. His notebook lay open, a fresh page waiting. He wrote out his goals, his hopes for the summer, and the kind of person he wanted to become. His pencil moved steadily, each line a promise to himself. He would make the most of this opportunity not just for him, but for everyone who had helped him along the way. And as the last light faded, Jamal felt a quiet certainty settle in. His story was still unfolding, and he was ready to step boldly into whatever came next. Jamal stood at the edge of the camp's main building, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. The campus sprawled out with crisp, modern buildings, framed by manicured lawns and winding paths. Groups of students moved between classes, their voices a low hum of conversation. The energy in the air was electric, a blend of ambition and possibility. Jamal's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, a quiet attempt to ground himself as he stepped further into this new world. Orientation had been a whirlwind of introductions and icebreakers, each activity designed to ease the transition into camp life. Jamal had always found such settings challenging, his natural quietness often mistaken for shyness. But here, surrounded by other students who shared his curiosity and drive, he felt a shift. The topics of conversation weren't just about hobbies or favorite movies, but delved into ideas and theories that sparked his mind. It was a place where asking, "What if?" was encouraged, where exploring the unknown was celebrated. The first week flew by. Each day brought new challenges, from advanced lectures on mathematical theories to hands-on workshops that pushed the boundaries of what he thought he knew. Jamal found himself in a small study group, a collection of students as diverse as their interests. There was Elena, who spoke passionately about astrophysics, and Malik, whose coding skills seemed almost magical. They quickly formed a rhythm, bouncing ideas off each other, dissecting problems with a mix of logic and creativity. Jamal's contributions, once hesitant, grew stronger, his voice finding its place among theirs. One afternoon, during a project on optimization algorithms, the group hit a roadblock. They sat in a circle, laptops open, notebooks filled with scribbled equations. The problem was complex, a tangled web of variables that resisted every attempt to simplify it. Frustration hung in the air, the kind that gnawed at the edges of patience. Jamal stared at the screen, his mind mapping out possibilities. He began sketching on his notebook, lines and shapes that seemed abstract until they weren't. His hand moved faster, the pattern emerging, a solution woven through the chaos. He hesitated for a moment, the old fear of being wrong creeping up, but he pushed it aside. He leaned forward, sharing his idea, walking the group through his thought process. As he spoke, he watched their faces shift, from confusion to understanding to excitement. Malik tested the theory, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The model ran smoothly, the error margins shrinking to zero. The room filled with a quiet awe, the kind that only comes when a breakthrough happens. They finished the project ahead of schedule, their report a testament to collaboration and persistence. The instructors took notice. Their project was selected for a showcase event, an opportunity to present their findings to a panel of visiting professors and industry professionals. The news spread quickly, and Jamal felt a mix of pride and disbelief. He had come to the camp hoping to learn, to absorb. But now he found himself not just a participant, but a leader. His journey had transformed. The quiet boy who had once sat at the back of the classroom, now standing at the front, sharing his ideas with confidence. The day of the presentation arrived, bringing with it a fresh wave of nerves. Jamal stood backstage, his teammates around him, each lost in their own preparation. The auditorium filled steadily, rows of seats occupied by peers, mentors, and strangers. The low murmur of the crowd wrapped around him, a reminder of the scale of what they were about to do. Jamal closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath, letting it out slowly. His mind sharpened, the path forward clear. When they took the stage, Jamal felt the weight of the moment. The projector cast a soft glow, the slides behind him a visual map of their journey. Malik began, his voice steady, introducing the problem they had faced. Elena followed, outlining their methodology, the steps they had taken to dissect the issue. When it was Jamal's turn, he stepped forward, the spotlight warm against his skin. He spoke of the breakthrough, how a shift in perspective had unlocked the solution. His words flowed naturally, a quiet strength in his tone. The audience remained still, their attention a tangible presence. The presentation ended with a ripple of applause, polite at first but growing in strength. The panel asked thoughtful questions, each one a chance to delve deeper into their work. Jamal answered some, his responses measured and thoughtful, each answer a thread in the fabric of their achievement. When they left the stage, a wave of relief washed over him, the kind that left his knees weak but his spirit strong. His teammates pulled him into a hug, their joy contagious, their connection unbreakable. As the event wound down, one of the professors approached them. She introduced herself as Dr. Lee, a researcher from a nearby university. She spoke of internships, of research opportunities, and Jamal felt the world expand around him. The possibilities unfurled like a map, each path leading to new adventures, new challenges. He exchanged contact information, his hands steady, his voice calm, but inside a fire burned bright and steady. That night, back in his dorm room, Jamal sat by the window. The campus was quiet, the world wrapped in the soft blanket of night. He opened his notebook, the pages filled with equations, sketches, and notes. He added a new page, not with formulas, but with words. A list of goals, dreams, and the steps needed to reach them. He wrote until the words ran out, until the page was full and his mind felt light. Jamal knew this was only the beginning. His story, once confined to the quiet corners of a middle school classroom, had grown. It was a story of finding his voice, of embracing his talent, of stepping into the unknown with courage.